application. So we're going to go in, we're going to manage app registrations, select new registration, and we're going to put some information here. So we're going to call this first app Hello ASP Net Core Identity 01. Now again, this application is only going to be accessible to users within our one specific tenant. So we're going to leave this option here where it's single tenant status. We'll set up the URI later. So let's go ahead and hit register. Now, one of the things is going to be helpful for us in a little bit is that we're going to need the application ID. We're going to need the directory tenant ID as part of our configuration files that we're going to set up in a little bit inside of Visual Studio Code. So what we're going to do is going to go ahead and copy the application ID, and I'm just going to put that in a notepad. Remember, the application ID is your client ID, and we've got the directory or basically the tenant ID. So I'm going to copy that, put that on my notepad here on the other screen, and we've got that information ready to go. All right, so now that we have that information handy for when we get down to Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and set up our redirect URIs. All right, so now we're here on this first section. What we need to do is go in and select and add a platform. And in this case, we're going to do a web page, which we're going to be hosting in .NET Core. And here we're going to put in two URLs. Now in this case, we're going to use localhost, and we're going to set it up to point to port 3007. And for the logout, we're going to do the same thing, but just change the URL to sign out. So let's fill that in. All right, and then the other thing we need to make sure we turn on for this application to work is we're going to turn on the implicit grant. We're going to do that for both access tokens as well as ID tokens. And this is basically going to allow us to authenticate from sort of that authorization endpoint. So it's important that that's turned on. So now that we've got those settings correct and entered, what we're going to do now is go ahead and hit configure. And we've already saved, so we're good to go. All right, so the next step is we're going to go ahead and inside of .NET Core, and we're going to create a single organization ASP.NET Core web application. So let's go over to PowerShell now. So what we're going to do is going to navigate down to the root directory of our C drive. And we're going to go ahead and create or check to see if we've got a folder called lab files. And in my case, I do not. So we're going to go ahead and create a folder called lab files. And we're going to change into that lab files directory. And inside of lab files, we're going to create a folder called single org. And we're going to change into that directory as well. All right, just to verify, we are now currently in our lab files single org directory folder. And what I want to do is I want to use .NET Core, and we're going to create a new project. Need to set up an MVC, and we're going to call the auth and point it and call it single org. And press enter. And we're going to go ahead and set this project up, so we have to give it a moment. All right, so now that our project files are created, let's go ahead and open it up in Visual Studio Code. So from this folder, we're just going to hit Code and open up Visual Studio Code. All right, so we're going to navigate to our folders. And as you'll see, we've got our project files and folders all set up for us. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to update and make some modifications to appsettings.json. So let's go ahead and open that up. All right, so now as I mentioned before, we were going to make some modifications to the tenant ID and the client ID. So I'm going to copy those from my notepad, and I'll walk you through that in a second. We also do need to define the domain that is part of the tenant. So in my case, my tenant is going to be an M365 account or name at onmicrosoft.com. So let me just replace my qualified domain name with that. There we go. Now tenant ID is going to be what we copied from that other screen earlier, which is the directory ID. So I'm going to replace tenant ID with the one I copied from my other machine, from the other screen, I should say, and paste that in. And then there's application ID, which is sort of the client ID. So let's copy that from my notepad and we'll set that up there. Perfect. All right, so now what we've done is we've established our domain for the tenant. We've got our tenant ID, which we copied again from that app registration page, as well as the client ID, which we've copied from that app registration page. So the next file we want to modify is going to be properties, and then it's going to be a file called launchsettings.json. So let's go into our properties folder. Let's open up launchsettings.json, and you'll see some information here. So the first thing we want to modify is the property URL here, the IIS Express application URL. So this should be localhost, and we're going to change that number to 3007. As well as the SSL port, we're going to change to 3007 as well. All right, and our final setting that we're going to modify is a file called index.cs.html, which is located in the views home folder. And there it is, index.cs.html. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually paste in some information here. So hold on, let me grab that information. And this information will be available to you in the lab notes for exercise 2. So this is the snippet we're looking for. And basically what we're doing is it's an if statement. And based on that condition, what we're going to do is use that to publish and produce the tokens that are generated during this login on screen so we can take a look at those. All right, so now we've modified our 3 files. Let's make sure we have saved all of them. Perfect. All right, so next step is we're going to go into .NET back at PowerShell, and we're going to do a build and a run. All right, so we're just giving them a few moments. And there we go, build successful. So now that we've built it, let's go ahead and do a .NET run, and let's get our project up and running. All right, so our code is up and running now. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and open up a web browser. And we're going to navigate to localhost 5001. And there we go. Now you'll notice I'm logged in as my demo user Megan B, but I wasn't challenged with a prompt because I was already within the Edge browser logged in currently. But as you can see, we've got our token information, object identifier, our claims, everything's all set up. All right, so let's move on to the next phase, which is implementing the authorization component. Now this is obviously going to happen once you've finished authenticating. Now we need to go through the process of authorizing. What access and what capabilities do you have at that point? So applications that are going to integrate with the Microsoft Identity Platform, they follow an authorization model, right, that gives users and administrators control over how the data can be accessed. So when you're thinking about like OAuth 2.0 authorization code flow, right, OAuth 2.0 is going to be a method where we're going to allow third-party applications the ability to access web resources, right, on behalf of a user. It's really important because we want to make sure that there's security, trust, and compliance in there. So there needs to be a mechanism where something can do something on behalf of a user. So this is really defined or sort of managed by defining permissions for resources like the Microsoft Graph, other Microsoft products, third-party resources, and it gives us the ability to have fine-grained control over the data and how the API functionality is going to be exposed. So a third-party app can request these permissions from users and administrators, and somebody needs to approve that request before the app can access the data or act on behalf of the user. So in OAuth 2, right, these type of permissions are called scopes, and they're often referred to as permissions. And a permission is represented in the Microsoft Identity Platform as a single string value. Think of it as an option like calendars.readWrite, right, and giving you the ability to read and write information from a user's calendar, in essence, on their behalf. So you can have an application that's maybe providing calendar updates and needs to go in and make those entries for me inside of my calendar. Now, delegated permissions are going to be used by apps that have a signed in user present. Now, for these apps, either the user or an administrator consents to the permission that the app has for its request. Then the app has delegated permissions to act as the signed in user when making calls to the target resource. Now, some delegated permissions can be consented to by non administrator users, but some higher privileged permissions do require sort of administrator consent. And of course, that application permissions are going to be used by those apps when they run without a signed in user present. So, for example, an app that runs as a background service or a daemon, these application permissions really can only be consented by an administrator, right? Just think about the security implications there. Now, to request consent for delegated permissions for all the users in a tenant, your app can use the admin consent endpoint. And this is going to be part of this process where the administrator can then grant consent for the application to act on behalf of any user within the tenant. So if the admin grants that consent for the entire tenant, the organization's users won't really see that page for that application, once it's been approved. Now, some high sort of privileged permissions in the Microsoft ecosystem can be set by the admin restricted. So for example, things like directory read write all, right? These type of permissions are only used by daemon services or other non-interactive applications that do need to run into the background. All right, so let's talk a little bit about admin consent. So admin consent, right? When you think about it, right, some permissions are going to require consent from an administrator, right, before they can be granted within the tenant. And obviously, you've got the ability from the admin consent endpoint, right, to grant permissions to the entire tenant. Now, that app registration UI display is going to sort of provide the permissions and the admin consent grant to your app, and it has the following options in that section, right? So it's going to be what the configured permissions are, other permissions that are going to be granted, and then of course there's that admin consent button. Now, the request the user's permission is going to come from a directory admin, and then of course understanding the application authorization and consent. Those would be some additional details in there as well. All right, so let's walk through a little bit of that application consent experience. Put a little more clarity in here. So, again, user consent flow, like when an application developer directs users, right, to that authentication endpoint, right, the intent is to record consent for only that user. Now, the admin consent flow, similar, we're going to basically record the consent, but we're doing it for obviously the entire tenant. So let's talk a little bit about that sort of that flow, right? So obviously we've got section one there, bullet one. That's going to be the user identifier in question, right? Who we trying to jump in or connect into on behalf of. We've got the title. What exactly is that title? Well, that title is going to be the changes of what we're trying to do. In this case, as you can see, it's permissions requested. We've got obviously any app logo information we want to put in, some visuals and graphics, just as a way to help identify that particular organization. And then there's details here in section 4 and 5, which go into the app name, the published domain, and then we get into section 6 here. And as you can see, this is going to be the permissions that we're asking for and requesting. And so these should always be evaluated, just to make sure that what's being requested is really within the organization's rules and such. There's also a permission description, which is going to be that section 7. And this is just going to give you the opportunity to provide some detail about what the service is exposing from a permissions perspective. And then from section 8 and 9, this just gives you the opportunity to put in terms of service, a privacy statement, as well as requests to go in and change those permissions through that link there, just to give individuals access to gain more data or have communication with the organization that's running that application. Now, inside of your application, you do have the ability to make modifications to API permissions. This could be done with things like the Microsoft APIs, APIs that your organization uses, right, as well as APIs that maybe individual developers have sort of deployed within an organization's tenant. So as you can see, we go to the API permissions section. There's that add a permission button. Here, in this case, on the right, you can see you can request access, again, to the Microsoft APIs, APIs within your org, or APIs that you may have deployed as an end user. Now, when you think about when you're building APIs, right, there's this notion of sort of building out a secure custom API, with the Microsoft identity. And so, there's sort of two main components to that. One is that you're going to register and configure in Azure AD application and define those scopes. And you're going to code your API project, configure the supported Microsoft identity, and then, of course, add that support to those validated requests, right, inside of those necessary scopes. Now, when you call the Microsoft Graph API, right, again, this is going to be our REST API endpoint, and the applications are going to use the Microsoft Graph API to do things like perform create, read, update, right, delete functions inside of the directory or inside of objects within the directory as well as within the applications. So what we provide is a REST-based endpoint authentication again with Azure AD. There is role-based authorization, so you've got RBAC capabilities. And some other benefits of using the Graph API as well is that we've got the ability to do differential queries. We've got some directory extension capabilities secured also by permission scopes. And when you enable application scenarios such as, line of business apps, right, single tenant application, or maybe thinking of it as a software as a service, multi-tenant based application, the graph is, going to give you that rich access to those data sets that you might need within a customer environment. So let's do a quick demo on implementing the authorization to consume an API. So what we're going to do in this demo is we're going to basically create a JavaScript single page application. We're going to allow it to sign in with personal accounts as well as work and school accounts. We're going to acquire an access token, and then we're going to call the Microsoft Graph API or any other API that requires access tokens from the Microsoft Identity Platform endpoint. Now, this sample application that's used in this exercise enables a JavaScript single-page app again to query the Graph API using that identity platform. And in this scenario, after a user signs in, an access token is going to be requested and then added to the HTTP requests through the authorization header. And the token acquisition and renewal are handled by the Microsoft Authentication Library, the MSAL. So let's go ahead and start setting that up. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to go down to GitHub and download an Active Directory JavaScript Graph API sample code. So let's pull up the browser and let's go to the following URL. So let's grab this GitHub link. Let's get this set up. Perfect. So now I'm going to go ahead and download the source code right here. It's a zip file. And I'm going to download that to my local machine. Now, once I download it to the local machine, let's pull up our Windows Explorer windows. All right, let's go into that zip file. Let's take this directory and let's take this full directory and place it into our lab files folder that we had created earlier today. All right, so we've got an Active Directory JavaScript Graph API v2 lab demo kit. All right, so now that we've got that downloaded, let's go into Visual Studio Code. And let's open up that project file or folder. All right, here it is. It's in my list. And as you can see, we've got a bunch of files. We'll be making some modifications, mostly to the index.html. But before we make modifications to index.html, let's go back into Azure Active Directory, and let's go ahead and set up our app registration here. All right, so back in portal.azure.com, let's go back into Azure Active Directory. In Azure Active Directory, we're going to go App Registrations, and we're going to go ahead and select New Registration. In here, we're going to call this JavaScript SPA, Single Page App. Now remember, we're going to select accounts in an organization, in any organization within our tenant, anybody that's outside of our organization, sort of the multi-tenant setup. And then in this case, our demo, we want to make sure we can get in some consumer-based accounts that are on Skype, Xbox, Facebook, etc. The redirect URI, what we want to put here is, because we're doing a single page app, and we're going to go ahead and put in a localhost address that's going to be available with our Node.js running. So localhost, and we're going to use port 30662, and we are all set there. All right, so again, we do need to remember to document our application ID. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this to the clipboard and put this on my notepad in my window below. Perfect. Now this application is going to require implicit grant flow. So we do need to go to authentication and select implicit grant for access tokens and ID tokens. So we'll select that and hit save. Now here we need to make some modifications and add some API permissions. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in here to API permissions. And one of the things we want to add is calendar.read. So we're going to go into the Microsoft APIs because we're going to access the Graph API. We're going to go here, Delegated Permissions, and we're going to search for calendar. And there's calendar.read. Perfect. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to select people. And we're going to select people.read. And then we're going to go ahead and add those permissions. And there we go. Permissions haven't been added. All right, so at this point, the next thing we need to do is grant admin consent. This way the users are not being prompted. So we'll go ahead and select grant admin consent. We'll set approve. And there we go. Grant the permission has been now granted, or admin consent has now been granted for that application. So at this point, our application is now ready to go from an Azure AD perspective. Now let's go into Visual Studio Code and make some modifications to the sample project that we have. All right, so let's get into Visual Studio Code. All right, here we are inside of our code. Again, we're going to be making modifications to the index.html file. So one of the things we need to do is make some modifications to the left container. So let's take a look. Here we go, left container. What we want to do is we want to add some changes here to this code. So let me grab that code snippet from the doc. And what we're basically going to do is replace that left container with one that has the ability to acquire the token. So let's take a look here. We've got to replace it. Take these 4 lines and we're going to replace it with these. And you'll see here one of the big differences is we're going to call on the click, we're going to call the acquired token pop up and call MSGraph. All right, we're going to go scroll down here to request objects, and we'll see we've got scopes. We've got one currently for user.read, we need to add one for people.read. In addition, we need to make a change to the graph endpoints, and we need to add a graph people endpoint. All right, now we also need to scroll down and change the acquire token pop-up section. So let's see here, function, there we go, function acquire token pop-up. So we're going to replace this code with a block of code that's in that document. All right, so let's replace this function here with some code that's slightly changed, focused on more of the people endpoint as opposed to the me endpoint. All right, so that's copied, perfect. Now we need to make a modification to the msal config section. And here we're going to have the application ID that we copied earlier. And we need to place that into that field there. So let me grab that from my notepad. And we're going to change this to that application ID that I created just a little while ago. Now you'll also notice that we've got the authority here and we've got enter tenant info here. There's a couple things you could do. We could add the tenant ID. If we did that, then we're sort of restricting the tenant to, or the application only to the tenant. We can use the word common, which is really what we're going to do in this situation, because we want to allow our tenant, other tenants, as well as users on social and public accounts. We also have the ability to do organization, which is going to allow your tenant as well as people that are federated to connect in. So here in this case, we're going to change enter the tenant info just to common. All right, that should cover it. Just let me check my notes. Yep, that covers all the settings we're going to do in these options. So let's make sure we save our files, file, and make sure we got it saved. Perfect. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and compile our code and run it. All right, so we are going to run npm install. And we need to run that npm install in the correct directory. So let's pull up the directory structure. We're going to go into the directory that we've been working on. And we'll try that again. Npm install. There we go. That looks better. All right, so we've added the right packages into that npm directory. And next step is we're going to go ahead and start our server. So node server.js. All right, and our server is currently listening on port 30662. So we're going to go ahead and open up the browser now. All right, so now we've gotten to our sample application. We're now at the page to welcome to the Microsoft Authentication Library for JavaScript Quick Start. All right, so let's go ahead and sign in as our user, Megan B. Now remember, I'm logged in the Edge browser with Megan B already. So as you see, I didn't even have to put my credentials in. Megan B has been signed in and authenticated. So I'll go ahead and sign out. And that's basically how we set up sort of the multi-tenant environment. All right, so let's take another 10-minute break. We'll get started with getting into working with the graph. As you can see, there's a great opportunity to leverage the Microsoft identity into your applications, allowing you to take full advantage of all the great resources, security, compliance capabilities of Azure AD. So let's take another 10-minute break. We'll see everyone back here, and we'll begin on Module 3.